The argument for motion is an argument that was first developed by Aristotle and then built upon by St. Thomas Aquinas. Their intention was to demonstrate the ultimate principle of motion, which they called God. Here, I will lay out the argument and support its premises.
Hello, and welcome to my first tutorial, How to Create a Universe, with me, God!
First, it is important to define what I mean by God. There are many senses in which we could mean the word God. The Muslim and the Christian God, for example, differ with respect to the doctrine of the Trinity. Similar things might be said about the Jewish and the Christian God, and so forth. What I am doing here, however, is demonstrating the most basic idea of God, which most theists can agree upon. For this reason, God will be defined here as the principle of existence, otherwise known as the creator of the universe, the first cause. The argument for motion can be summarized in the following syllogism. Premise 1. Everything that is changing is being changed by something else. Premise 2. But the series of changers and things changing cannot be infinitely long. Therefore, there must be a first cause of all change, which we call God. Again, the sense in which I mean God here is the first cause. The fact that there is change is clear and evident to our senses. The earth is changing in illumination. Your intellect is changing with new knowledge. The cars outside are continuously changing location, etc. Change is an obvious empirical fact, and this argument stands on that empirical evidence. It is also clear that things may not change without being changed by something, which has the principle of that change within it. The principle of that change must either be of itself or of something else, for there is no other option. If things did change without the principle of that change, then one might ask, why do things change? The only possible answer would be that things change for no reason. This, however, is clearly contrary to our experience and an irrational position by definition. Now, something is moved by itself when it does not depend upon something else for its motion, but has this motion primarily. It is clear that if a thing's motion is dependent upon something else, then it is not moving itself primarily. An animal's movement, for example, is dependent upon its legs moving, so we say the animal is moved by its legs. Another thing that Aristotle notes is that everything that moves is divisible. Supposing we have some object A, B, we can divide it into parts, for example, A, C, and C, B. The problem, Aristotle points out, is that if part CB were to stop moving, for example, then the whole would stop moving. Thus, the whole depends upon its parts for its motion, and it does not move primarily as a whole, but by its parts. As Aquinas said, Aristotle, therefore, shows the cause why no mobile moves itself. It is because there cannot be a first mobile whose motion does not depend on its parts any more than the first being can be divisible. For the existence of any divisible depends on the parts. Hence, this conditional is true. If the part is not being moved, neither is the whole, just as this one is true. If the part does not exist, the whole does not. That one thing does not change itself seems evidently true from our senses. everything that we have observed change only changes due to something else changing it, or because part of the object changes it. This is clearly inductive reason to accept the premise that whatever changes is changed by another. Another reason begins with the principle of proportionate causality. This is the idea that something cannot give what it does not have to give. For example, one object cannot give energy to another object which it does not have. It would be absurd for a car to run on an empty tank of gas, or for a rabbit to materialize from thin air. Why? Because not only do we require a reason for things to exist, but a sufficient reason. Simply explaining that the empty tank of gas caused the car to run, or that the air caused the rabbit to materialize, is not a sufficient reason. The cause must be actual in respect to the potential effect. That is, the rabbit must actually exist in some way. For example, under the table, in order for it to pop out of the magician's hat. Or the energy moving the car must exist in some way. For example, in the gas. Something cannot change itself because it would have to be actual in respect to that potential. But if something were actual with respect to that potential, then it would not be potential but actual. For example, if all of the conditions for a car to be in location X rather than Y were in the car, then the car would already be in location X. To move from potentiality to actuality, the required conditions must exist in something other than the thing in potentiality, which are then given to the thing in potentiality, making it actual. In conclusion, whatever changes must be changed by another. It is important to note that the second premise has nothing to do with an infinite series into the past. In other words, St. Thomas Aquinas did not argue that the universe must begin to exist. On the contrary, he denied this could be demonstrated. What he is arguing is that there is a regress of things depending on a set of conditions for change, which exist at the time of the change. Remember how the dividing of an object into parts lead to a regress of the whole thing depending on its parts, for example. This is not a regress into the past, but during the time the change exists. Here, Aristotle and Aquinas ask whether the series can be infinite during this time, or if there must be a first mover. Aristotle gives an argument which is related to Zeno's paradox. See this video for an explanation of that paradox. Basically, Zeno says that space is infinitely divisible, which Zeno supposes means space is made of an infinite number of points. So, if we have an object moving from place X to place Y in a finite time, t1, the area between them is infinitely divisible, and hence the object must move through an infinite number of points. The problem is, how is it that one can move through an infinite number of points in a finite time? It would seem that moving through an infinite number of points would have no beginning nor end. But saying that one passes through this space in a finite time necessarily means that there is a beginning and an end, which appears to be a contradiction. The way Aristotle solves this paradox is by saying that space is divisible only in potentiality, and not actually. The line is not composed of an infinite number of points which one must pass through, but is continuous. If we accept that solution, then we can get to Aristotle's argument against an infinite regress. Now remember, Aristotle showed that the motion of the whole depends on the motion of its parts. So remember, we have AB, and we can divide that object into AC and CB. If we continue to divide the object, where, for example, AC and CB explains the motion of AB, ACD and DCA explains the motion in AC, BCD and DCB explains the motion in CB, and continue this ad infinitum. This would be a sufficient explanation of the motion of the object, according to some people. But here's the problem. Each time we divide the object, we are dividing it into parts, taking up definite space. So if we continue to divide an object into infinity, there ends up being an infinite space, not just potentiality, but in actuality, since each of the parts must be actual to cause the motion of the whole. Therefore, we would have an infinite motion. This would be impossible because the whole AB would still be moving from location X to Y in a finite time, but through an infinite space, which makes Zeno's paradox a real problem rather than a potential problem. Hence, an infinite regress of movers is impossible. The main reason an infinite regress is impossible in this case is because of the dependence of the moved on the mover. If each thing had the power on its own to be moved, then there would be no problem, because each thing in the series would be the sufficient reason for the motion of the next. However, what has been demonstrated is that no thing is in motion of itself, but the cause of that motion lies in something else. Having an infinite series of things in motion would not solve the problem, because none of these things have the principle of motion primarily. To say otherwise would be like saying a paintbrush cannot move itself. But if we attach an infinitely long handle, the paintbrush can move itself, and it even creates a beautiful painting. This does not make sense, because again, the paintbrush does not have the principle of motion in it primarily, so it must receive this principle from something that does, the first mover. Another example Animating Rebel has pointed out is with a chain of command. If your request for a raise must go through an infinite chain of command, then you will never get a raise. Not because the chain is infinite, but because none of the bosses in the series has the principle of giving raises primarily, but receives it from the top boss. But in this infinite series of chain of command, none of them have it primarily, and hence cannot get the raise. This is analogous to things changing. So we reach our conclusion. There must be a first cause of all change, which we call God. This is because we only have three options: self-causation, infinite regress, or first mover. By process of elimination, we have reached to the first mover. I do plan to further show what God must be, and this could take a while for me to get around to, but I think this is enough for one video. Thanks for watching.